Jonah's car rattled along the cracked, desolate road as the sun's light began to wane. The solar eclipse was near its peak, casting an eerie half-light over the barren landscape. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, their movements almost imperceptibly wrong, as if they were alive, creeping closer with every second. His GPS had failed miles back, leaving him to navigate an unmarked road that twisted like a serpent through the lifeless terrain. Just as he began to consider turning back, a colossal structure appeared in the distance, as if summoned by the dimming sun itself. The building was a hotel, its faded grandeur barely visible through a veil of encroaching mist. Its windows glinted with an otherworldly luminescence, reflecting the dying sunlight in sharp, blinding flashes. A massive, ornate sign hung precariously from rusted chains above the entrance, Eclipse Eternal Inn. The letters seemed to shimmer, shifting slightly as Jonas stared, as if they were etched in liquid shadow. His heart pounded against his ribs, an instinctive warning to stay away. Yet an inexplicable force pulled him forward, like the gravity of a black hole. As Jonas stepped out of his car, the air felt dense and electric, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. The temperature dropped sharply, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic creaking of the hotel sign swinging in a non-existent breeze. The building's exterior was adorned with intricate carvings, twisting shapes that seemed to writhe under the dim light of the eclipse. Jonas couldn't shake the sensation that the carvings were watching him, their hollow eyes boring into his very soul. Approaching the entrance, he noticed footprints in the dirt leading toward the massive double doors. The prints were mismatched, some human, others not. They ended abruptly, as though their owners had been swallowed whole. Jonas hesitated, his hand trembling as it reached for the tarnished brass handle. As his fingers brushed the metal, a whisper, soft yet piercing, echoed in his ear, "Welcome back." He spun around, but the road was empty, his car now shrouded in an unnatural fog. There was no escape. The hotel had claimed him. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something far more foul, rotting wood, decaying flowers, and a metallic tang that Jonas didn't want to identify. The lobby stretched out before him, impossibly vast for a building of its size. Chandeliers hung precariously from high ceilings, their crystal beads swaying gently, though the air was still. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the faded patterns revealing words written in a language Jonas couldn't decipher. He caught glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing, only the oppressive weight of the hotel's gaze. A grandfather clock stood at the center of the room, its pendulum swinging erratically, ticking in a rhythm that didn't match the beat of time. Jonas approached it, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The closer he got, the louder the ticking became, transforming into a deafening roar inside his skull. Then, the pendulum stopped mid-swing, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the lobby was no longer empty. Figures stood in the corners, shrouded in shadow, their faces obscured but their eyes glowing faintly. They didn't move, yet Jonas felt them leaning toward him, their presence suffocating. His instincts screamed for him to run, but his legs were frozen in place. And then, from somewhere deep within the hotel, came the sound of a piano playing a haunting, discordant melody. It echoed through the halls, growing louder with each passing second, as if beckoning Jonas deeper into the bowels of the building. Fear clawed at his throat, but curiosity burned brighter, its flame fueled by the oppressive pull of the unknown. Unaware that the doors had silently shut behind him, Jonas took his first hesitant step into the heart of the Eclipse Eternal Inn, the sound of the piano growing louder, each note more menacing than the last. The dimly lit hallway stretched before Jonas, its flickering wall sconces casting dancing shadows that seemed alive. His breath caught in his throat as he noticed the air growing colder with each step, his exhalations now visible in thin, ghostly wisps. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally, overlapping in a way that made it feel like someone, or something, was following him. He turned sharply, but the corridor behind him was empty. Yet, the sensation of being watched gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Jonas stumbled into a room at the end of the hallway, its heavy wooden door creaking open as if it had been waiting for him. The room smelled of aged paper and damp earth, a library of sorts, filled with books stacked haphazardly on shelves that reached impossibly high ceilings. In the center of the room sat a single wooden table, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. Atop it lay an open book, its pages blank save for one phrase scrawled in the center. "You have been here before." A shiver ran down his spine as he stared at the words. They were written in a handwriting he recognized, a perfect match to his father's. His heart raced as he reached for the book, but before he could touch it, the pages began to flip violently on their own. A rush of air swept through the room, carrying whispers that echoed faintly, overlapping and growing louder. Jonas could barely make out fragmented words. The eclipse lost return. He backed away from the table, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. As he turned to leave, something glinted on one of the nearby shelves. It was a small silver object, half buried among the books. Trembling, Jonas pulled it free. A pocket watch, its surface engraved with intricate eclipses. His fingers ran over the cool metal, and a chill of recognition washed over him. He had seen this watch before, in a photograph of his father taken just days before his disappearance. The watch suddenly ticked to life, its hands spinning wildly before stopping abruptly at midnight. A haunting chime echoed through the room, followed by the faint sound of laughter, childlike, yet distorted. Jonas froze, his grip tightening around the watch as the air grew dense with a presence he couldn't see, but could feel pressing against him. He turned to face the table, and his blood ran cold. The blank pages of the book were no longer empty. They now displayed a photograph of Jonas as a child, standing in front of the Eclipse Eternal Inn. His younger self was holding his father's hand, but the figure beside him didn't look entirely human. Its features were blurred, like a smudge on glass, and its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. Jonas staggered backward, the book snapping shut with a deafening clap that reverberated through the room. As the whispers in the air grew louder, Jonas was flooded with memories he didn't recall living. Scenes of him wandering the halls of the hotel as a boy, hearing his father's voice calling from behind locked doors, and feeling the same oppressive fear that now consumed him. He clutched his head as the memories overwhelmed him, his mind torn between past and present. Then the laughter returned, echoing from the hallway. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps, small and rapid, like those of a child running. Jonas felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, and when he spun around, he caught a glimpse of a figure darting into the shadows. It was the child from the photograph, himself, impossibly young and impossibly here. The library's door slammed shut, trapping Jonas inside. The walls began to close in, their surfaces twisting and warping into grotesque faces that whispered his name. He stared at the pocket watch, its ticking now matching the erratic beat of his heart. It felt as if the hotel itself was peeling away the layers of his mind, forcing him to confront a forgotten truth. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, guttural voice that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the hotel. "You were always meant to return. The eclipse binds you to us." Jonas screamed, his voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness that surged forward like a living entity. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the watch's hands spinning backward, pulling him further into the tangled web of his forgotten past. Jonas awoke to the sound of distant bells, their deep, mournful tolls vibrating through the walls of the hotel. The room around him had changed. The library was gone, replaced by a cavernous hall lined with arched windows that offered no view, only a void of endless blackness. The air shimmered, heavy with an unearthly pressure, and Jonas struggled to his feet, clutching the pocket watch tightly in his hand. It ticked faintly now, its rhythm irregular, as though it was breathing. Ahead of him stood two doors, identical in their ornate design. Each bore an inscription in a language Jonas couldn't decipher, but as he stared, the markings twisted and reshaped themselves into words he could understand. On the left door, the inscription read, "What you cherish, you must surrender." On the right, "What you fear, you must embrace." A wave of nausea rolled over him as he realized he was being forced to choose. The space between the doors felt alive, a swirling vortex of shadow and light that whispered incoherently. Jonas stepped closer, his legs heavy, as if the air itself fought against his movement. He reached for the left door, and the whispering ceased, replaced by a chilling silence. His fingers brushed the handle, and suddenly, the world around him dissolved. He was standing in his childhood bedroom. Everything was as he remembered, the faded wallpaper with stars peeling at the edges, the small wooden bed with its frayed blanket. On the nightstand sat an old photo of his father holding him as a baby, both smiling under the glow of an eclipse. But the room felt wrong. The shadows were too long, too sharp, and his reflection in the cracked mirror across the room didn't match his movements. A voice, low and gravelly, spoke from the mirror. To save him, you must give up the memory of his love. Jonas froze, staring at the reflection as it distorted and morphed into a darkened version of himself. Choose, or you will both be lost. The room began to quake, the walls peeling away to reveal a swirling black abyss dotted with faint glimmers of light, stars maybe, or the souls of those who had come before. Jonas stumbled backward, and he was once again in the hall, the left door now glowing faintly. The right door began to pulse, a deep crimson light spilling from its edges. Compelled, he approached it, and the whispers returned, louder and clearer. They chanted his name, their voices layered with anguish and malice. He opened the door, and the hotel dissolved once more. This time, he stood in a darkened forest, the trees towering over him like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The air was filled with the sound of footsteps, quick and erratic, circling him. Suddenly, his father emerged from the shadows, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and void of life. He reached out a trembling hand, and Jonas's heart shattered. "Help me, son," his father rasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jonas moved to embrace him, but his father's form began to shift, stretching and contorting into something inhuman. A towering, grotesque figure now stood before him, its face a swirling mass of eclipses, each one burning with an unnatural light. "You fear this," the creature hissed, its voice a cacophony of tones, some human, others unrecognizable. "But fear is the price of salvation." Jonas fell to his knees, the weight of the creature's presence pressing him into the earth. The two doors reappeared in the forest, their inscriptions glowing brighter than before. He realized the truth. One door would erase his memory of his father, freeing Jonas but dooming his father's soul to remain trapped in the hotel. The other would force Jonas to confront the entity, risking his sanity and his life in the process. The choice was impossible. Tears streamed down Jonas's face as he screamed at the void, the weight of his decision crushing him. The creature loomed closer, its form pulsating, feeding on his despair. "Decide," it commanded, "or be consumed." Jonas gripped the pocket watch tightly, its ticking now perfectly synchronized with his racing heartbeat. It felt warm in his hand, as if urging him toward a decision. Jonas's trembling hand hovered between the two doors. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and the whispers louder. His time was running out, and he knew whatever he chose would alter his life and soul forever. Jonas stood frozen between the two doors, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that made every breath a struggle. The hotel around him seemed to shift and pulse, its walls alive with an unnatural rhythm. As he hesitated, the silence was broken by a faint whisper, a sound so soft it could have been the wind, except it wasn't. It carried a tone, a cadence, like a voice just out of reach. Jonas, it was his name, drawn out in a rasping breath that sent shivers coursing through his body. He spun around, searching the dim corridor, but it was empty. Yet the whisper persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Jonas, this way." It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, crawling beneath his skin. The faint glow of the pocket watch flickered, and for the briefest moment, he saw a figure at the edge of his vision. A woman in tattered, flowing clothes, her face obscured by shadows. She was watching him from the end of the hallway, her head tilted unnaturally, as if questioning his presence. The whisper grew sharper, almost a hiss, as the figure raised a hand and pointed toward an open doorway that hadn't been there before. The doorway was shrouded in darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to breathe, exhaling cold air that smelled of damp earth and decay. Jonas's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to run, but his feet betrayed him, pulling him toward the doorway as if compelled by an unseen force. As he crossed the threshold, the air shifted, and the whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices. They overlapped, some pleading, others mocking, their tones a mix of anguish and malice. Jonas felt his knees weaken, his hands trembling as the voices closed in around him. The room was a vast, circular chamber, its walls covered in writhing shadows that twisted and stretched like living things. The shadows formed faces, distorted, hollow-eyed, their mouths opening in silent screams. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate mirror, its surface rippling like water under moonlight. Jonas approached cautiously, his reflection flickering in and out of view. For a moment, he saw himself as he was, a terrified man clutching a pocket watch, but then the image shifted. His reflection became a gaunt, hollow version of himself, with blackened eyes and a twisted smile that didn't belong to him. The reflection raised its hand, mimicking Jonas's movement, and then it stopped, moving independently. "Do you know what you've become?" the reflection asked, its voice a distorted echo of Jonas's own. The question lingered in the air, heavy and accusing, as the shadows around the room grew more frantic. Jonas tried to look away, but the mirror seemed to pull his gaze back, holding him captive. The whispers began again, this time coming directly from the glass. They formed words, disjointed phrases that burrowed into his mind. Lost, betrayed, abandoned, return. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled violently, and a hand shot out from within, clawing at Jonas's arm. It was cold and slimy, its grip impossibly strong as it began to drag him closer to the glass. He struggled, his free hand clawing at the floor, but the room itself seemed to turn against him. The shadows coiled around his legs, pulling him deeper into the mirror's grasp. As his body was dragged closer, the whispers became screams, and the faces on the walls began to weep black tears that dripped onto the floor, forming pools of darkness. Jonas's own reflection stared back at him, its expression one of cruel satisfaction. He could hear the figure from the hallway, the woman, laughing softly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You were warned, Jonas. But you never listen." Just as the hand was about to pull him into the mirror completely, Jonas grabbed the pocket watch and held it aloft. The faint glow intensified, filling the room with a blinding white light. The shadows recoiled, screeching, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 shards, each fragment reflecting a distorted piece of the room. The hand released him, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When the light faded, the room was empty. The shadows, the mirror, and the woman had all vanished, leaving Jonas alone in the cold, silent chamber. But the whispers hadn't disappeared completely. They lingered at the edges of his consciousness, faint and insidious, promising that the terror wasn't over. The doorway behind him was gone, replaced by another hall stretching endlessly into the darkness. The pocket watch ticked faintly in his hand, its glow now dimmer than before, as if it, too, had been weakened by the encounter. Jonas rose shakily, the sense of dread settling deeper in his chest. The shadows might have receded, but he knew they were still watching, waiting for him to falter. "You're running out of time," the whispers said, their words echoing in his mind as he stepped forward into the unknown. Jonas moved deeper into the endless hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The walls around him began to ripple, their surface no longer solid but resembling a viscous, oily liquid that pulsed faintly with each beat of his heart. The faint ticking of the pocket watch in his hand echoed unnaturally, growing louder as if mocking his escalating fear. Shadows twisted and flickered along the walls, and Jonas realized they didn't belong to him. They moved with purpose, darting and swaying like hunters circling prey. The whispers returned, more persistent now, forming fragmented sentences that teased the edges of comprehension. "You can't escape. You belong here. It knows you." The words were spoken in different tones, as if a crowd surrounded him, pressing closer with every step. Jonas felt the weight of countless unseen eyes, their presence suffocating and intimate. He tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to him like a second skin, cold and unyielding. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a vast chamber, illuminated by a pale, unnatural glow. In the center of the room stood a large pedestal, and atop it rested a strange artifact, a black, polished orb that seemed to absorb the light around it. The air in the chamber grew heavy, vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum. Jonas's breath hitched as he felt the orb pulling at him, an invisible force urging him closer. The whispers grew louder, turning into an overlapping chorus of voices. Each seemed to speak directly to him, addressing his deepest fears and weaknesses. "You failed him, Jonas. You were too late. Why didn't you stop it? You could have saved him." The voices twisted his memories, pulling scenes from his past and warping them into accusations. His father's face flashed before him, gaunt and pale, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You left me here, Jonas," the image said, its voice dripping with venom. Jonas fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices clawed at his sanity. The pocket watch in his hand burned against his skin, its heat searing as if it wanted to be let go. He looked at the orb, its surface now swirling with faint images, fragments of his life reflected back at him in grotesque distortion. He saw himself as a boy, standing alone under an eclipse, his father's voice calling out, but never reaching him. He saw his father's outstretched hand, and then the moment it disappeared into darkness. As the orb's pull intensified, Jonas felt a strange temptation rising within him. The voices whispered promises now, their tones shifting to something almost soothing. "Touch it, Jonas. It will give you answers. The pain will stop." The whispers offered an end to his suffering, a chance to see his father again, to undo everything that had gone wrong. But beneath their promises lay an unmistakable malice, a predatory hunger that chilled him to the bone. Jonas crawled closer to the pedestal, unable to resist the pull entirely. The orb seemed alive, its surface rippling as if it anticipated his touch. His trembling hand hovered above it, the air around the artifact crackling with a sinister energy. As his fingers grazed the surface, a wave of darkness shot through him, cold and suffocating. His vision blurred, and he was suddenly standing in another place. The room was familiar, a replica of his childhood home. Everything was eerily pristine, untouched by time. But the air carried an overwhelming sense of wrongness, a suffocating weight that pressed down on his chest. The shadows here moved unnaturally, pooling in corners and slithering along the walls. Jonas heard faint laughter, high-pitched and echoing, as if a child was playing somewhere in the house. He followed the sound, his footsteps unnaturally loud against the wooden floor. The laughter led him to the living room, where a figure sat in his father's old armchair. It was a child, but not just any child. It was him, younger, no older than 10. The boy turned to face Jonas, his eyes pitch black, his mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. "You can't run from it, Jonas," the boy said, his voice layered with other voices, each one cruel and mocking. Jonas stumbled back, but the room began to dissolve around him, the walls peeling away to reveal an endless void. The boy rose from the chair, his movements jerky and unnatural, and began to walk toward him. "You let him go," the boy whispered, his voice soft but cutting like glass. "And now you'll stay, just like he did." The orb's pull grew stronger, and Jonas was dragged back to the chamber, the artifact glowing faintly now, as if it had fed on his fear. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, his mind reeling from the visions. The whispers around him grew triumphant, their chorus filled with malice and delight. The shadows on the walls moved closer, their forms coalescing into shapes that vaguely resembled human figures, distorted, hollow, and wrong. Jonas realized the truth. The orb was testing him, feeding on his fear and despair, using his own memories to break him. The whispers promised relief, but he now understood that touching the orb fully would mean surrendering everything, his will, his memories, his soul. Clutching the pocket watch tightly, Jonas forced himself to his feet, his knees shaking as the room began to close in. The shadows hissed, the whispers screamed, and the orb pulsed violently, desperate to claim him. But Jonas turned away, stumbling back toward the hallway, refusing to give in. As he crossed the threshold, the whispers faded to a low murmur, their disappointment palpable. The hallway stretched before him once again, but something had changed. The walls now bore strange, glowing symbols that pulsed faintly in time with the watches ticking. Jonas's fear lingered, heavy and oppressive, but a small spark of defiance burned within him. The orb had tempted him, but he had resisted for now. Yet, deep down, he knew the hotel wasn't done with him. Jonas stumbled through the endless corridor, the weight of the hotel pressing down on him like a crushing vice. The glowing symbols etched into the walls pulsed with an erratic rhythm, growing brighter with every step, as if guiding him toward something, or someone. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with a faint metallic tang that Jonas couldn't shake. His grip on the pocket watch tightened, its faint ticking now synchronized with his pounding heartbeat. At the end of the corridor stood a massive, ironclad door, its surface covered in carvings that seemed to writhe under the dim light. The carvings depicted eclipses in various stages, surrounded by shadowy figures with hollow eyes and twisted mouths. As Jonas approached, the door began to groan, shifting slightly as though it were breathing. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, their fragmented sentences overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "He's waiting. It's too late. You were always meant to come back." Jonas hesitated, his instincts screaming for him to turn around, but the pull of the door was irresistible. With a trembling hand, he reached for the handle. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, a wave of energy surged through him, and the corridor dissolved into darkness. When the light returned, Jonas found himself standing in an enormous circular chamber, its ceiling lost to shadows. In the center of the room was a massive stone altar, its surface stained with dark, ancient marks that pulsed faintly like veins beneath the skin. Suspended above the altar was an eclipse, impossibly large and impossibly close, its black core radiating an eerie glow that cast the room in a dim, shifting light. The eclipse seemed alive, its edges writhing like tendrils reaching out to consume everything around it. Jonas's gaze was drawn to a figure standing near the altar. It was his father, or at least, it looked like him. The man's features were gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and void of life, and his movements were jerky, as though he were a puppet on invisible strings. He turned slowly to face Jonas, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow, layered with an unnatural resonance. "Jonas, you came back. I waited for so long." Tears filled Jonas's eyes as he stepped forward, his heart torn between relief and dread. "Dad, what happened to you?" "I've been looking for you." But as he moved closer, the figure's smile twisted into something grotesque, and his voice became sharper, colder. "You left me here," the man hissed, his face contorting into something inhuman. "You were supposed to save me, but instead, you abandoned me to this place." Jonas froze, his mind reeling as the figure advanced toward him. The shadows in the room began to writhe, taking on forms that resembled the faces he had seen earlier, distorted and hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. The eclipse above the altar pulsed violently, and Jonas felt its energy clawing at his mind, threatening to pull him into its darkness. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented sentences now forming a single, unified voice that spoke directly to him. "The eclipse binds us all. Your blood brought you here, and your blood will set it free." Jonas's father, or whatever this entity was, pointed toward the altar. "It needs you, Jonas. Only you can finish what was started. But it will cost you everything." On the altar, Jonas saw the pocket watch he had been clutching moments ago, now glowing with an intense, blinding light. He realized it had been guiding him here all along, a cruel tool of the hotel's dark purpose. The entity stepped closer, its form shifting and elongating, its voice now a guttural growl. "The watch carries your family's debt. One must stay. One must feed the eclipse." Jonas's mind raced as the room closed in around him. The air was thick with dread, the weight of the decision crushing him. He could feel the eclipse's pull, its hunger seeping into his very being. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the shadows surged forward, their cold tendrils brushing against his skin. The truth became clear. He had two choices. He could place the pocket watch on the altar, sacrificing himself to the eclipse and ending the hotel's hold on his family. Or he could try to destroy it, knowing full well that such an act might doom him, and his father, to an eternity of torment within the hotel's grasp. Jonas stepped toward the altar, his heart pounding as he weighed his decision. The shadows screamed around him, the entity now circling like a predator waiting for the kill. The eclipse above grew brighter, its tendrils reaching for him, promising release, oblivion, and salvation. With trembling hands, Jonas reached out, the pocket watch burning like fire in his grip. His choice would determine not only his fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever been consumed by the hotel. The room seemed to hold its breath, the whispers falling silent as Jonas made his decision. The blinding light from the eclipse faded, leaving Jonas disoriented and trembling. The chamber had transformed into something unrecognizable, a nightmarish amalgamation of twisted architecture, shifting shadows, and pulsating walls that seemed alive. The air was thick with the stench of decay and sulfur, and every breath felt like inhaling ash. The altar at the center now glowed faintly, the pocket watch resting atop it, its ticking echoing unnaturally loud, as if counting down to an inevitable end. Jonas's father, or the grotesque entity wearing his face, stood across the room, its body no longer human. Its limbs had elongated, its fingers curling like talons, and its face was a hollow void where its eyes should have been. The mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows of jagged, mismatched teeth. The creature's voice was no longer his father's. It was deep, guttural, and layered with tones that didn't belong to this world. "You are too late, Jonas," it growled, its words reverberating through the chamber. "The eclipse has chosen you. There is no escape." The eclipse above had grown larger, its tendrils of light and shadow reaching farther, writhing like living things. Jonas could feel its pull in his chest, as though it were trying to tear his soul from his body. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, a deafening cacophony of overlapping voices that promised doom and despair. "Join us, surrender, become part of the cycle." Jonas stepped back, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't run. The hotel would never let him leave. His only chance was to fight, though how one could fight something so ancient and malevolent was beyond him. He looked at the pocket watch on the altar, its glow dimming with each tick. He realized it was the key to everything, the link between himself, his father, and the cursed power of the eclipse. The creature lunged at him, moving with an unnatural speed that defied logic. Jonas barely had time to react, diving to the side as its claws raked the air where he had stood. The impact of its movement shook the ground, and the chamber groaned as cracks formed in the walls, spilling an inky black substance that writhed like living tar. Jonas scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting toward the pocket watch. "You can't stop it," the creature hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "Your father tried, and now he is mine. You will join him, and the eclipse will feast." Jonas's grip on reality felt fragile as the chamber twisted and warped around him. The shadows came alive, forming ghostly figures faces he recognized as the previous victims of the hotel. They reached out to him, their expressions filled with agony and desperation. "Save us," they whispered, their voices like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "End this." Summoning every ounce of courage, Jonas sprinted toward the altar. The creature roared in rage, its massive form crashing into his path. It towered over him now, its body a writhing mass of shadow and bone, its hollow eyes glowing with the light of 1,000 eclipses. Jonas felt paralyzed by its presence, his legs refusing to move as it loomed closer. "You are nothing," it snarled. "A pawn in a game you cannot comprehend. Surrender, and I will make your end swift." But Jonas refused to yield. He raised the pocket watch, its glow intensifying as he gripped it tightly. The creature recoiled slightly, as if the watch's light burned it. Jonas realized this was his chance. He lunged toward the altar, slamming the watch into its surface with all his strength. The chamber trembled violently, and the eclipse above pulsed, its tendrils flailing wildly as a deafening roar filled the space. The creature screamed, its body unraveling as the watch's light spread across the room. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as they were pulled toward the altar, consumed by the light. The ghostly figures around Jonas began to dissolve, their tortured expressions softening into relief as they faded away. But the battle wasn't over. The creature's form began to coalesce again, its rage now palpable. It charged toward Jonas, its claws slashing through the air. At the last moment, Jonas grabbed the watch and pointed it toward the eclipse. The light exploded outward, a blinding wave that engulfed the room. Jonas felt himself being lifted off the ground, his body weightless as the light surrounded him. The creature's roars faded into silence, and the chamber began to collapse around him. The last thing he saw was the eclipse shrinking, its tendrils retracting as it was consumed by the watch's light. When the light faded, Jonas found himself lying on the cold, hard ground outside the hotel. The building was gone, replaced by an empty field under a clear, starry sky. The pocket watch lay in his hand, its ticking now silent. Jonas stared at it, his mind reeling. He had survived, but at what cost? The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered, an echo of the terror he had endured. As Jonas stood and walked away, the field grew silent. But in the distance, faintly, the ticking of the pocket watch began again. Jonas stood in the empty field where the hotel once loomed, the silence pressing against him like a weight. The cool night air was still, unnervingly quiet, as if the world held its breath. Above him, the stars shimmered faintly, their light now distant and indifferent. The pocket watch in his hand no longer glowed. Its face was cracked, the hands frozen at the moment of the eclipse. But even in its stillness, it felt alive, faintly pulsing against his palm like a heartbeat. As he took a step forward, the ground beneath him seemed unnaturally soft, as though it were absorbing his weight. He looked back to where the hotel had once stood, expecting to see nothing, but instead, the faint outline of its structure shimmered like a mirage. The longer he stared, the clearer it became, a shadow of its former self, standing between reality and some unseen dimension. The sight sent a chill down his spine, and he quickly turned away, unwilling to test if it was real or another trick of the eclipse's lingering power. The path ahead stretched endlessly, the moon casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and stretch toward him. Each step felt heavier, as though the hotel's influence still clung to him, refusing to let him go. Jonas tried to focus on the relief of surviving, but his mind was a battlefield of fragmented memories. The faces of those trapped within the hotel, their silent screams and pleading whispers haunted him. His father's hollowed gaze burned into his mind, a reminder of the impossible choices he had faced. Had he truly saved anyone, or was this simply another layer of the hotel's curse? The cracked face of the watch had changed. Instead of numbers, the surface reflected the eclipse in perfect detail, its black core swirling with faint tendrils of light. Within the reflection, Jonas saw himself, not as he was, but distorted and hollow, his eyes darkened and his face twisted in a silent scream. He dropped the watch instinctively, but it didn't hit the ground. Instead, it hovered before him, spinning slowly as the whispers grew louder. A voice rose above the whispers, deep and resonant, filled with both malice and authority. "You cannot run from the eclipse, Jonas. You are marked, as all before you were. The cycle demands a guardian." The voice seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating in his bones. Jonas shook his head, his breathing ragged. "No, I destroyed it. I ended this," he shouted into the void. But the voice only laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. "You delayed it, the voice replied, its tone dripping with mockery. "The eclipse cannot be destroyed. It is eternal. And now, so are you." The field around Jonas began to dissolve, the earth crumbling into an infinite void. He tried to run, but his feet sank into the ground, which felt like liquid, pulling him down. The stars above vanished completely, leaving him in a suffocating darkness illuminated only by the faint glow of the pocket watch. The watch rose higher, spinning faster, its glow intensifying until it became blinding. Then, everything stopped. Jonas found himself back in the circular chamber of the hotel, the altar before him. The eclipse hung in the air, smaller but no less menacing, its tendrils coiled tightly as if waiting. The pocket watch was now embedded in the altar, its ticking synchronized with the pulsing light of the eclipse. Jonas fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the crushing realization. He hadn't escaped the hotel, he had become part of it. The whispers around him began to fade, replaced by a single, ominous sound, the steady, relentless ticking of the watch. As Jonas sat in the chamber, the shadows began to stir again, coalescing into faint figures, the next victims of the hotel, drawn by the eclipse's pull. He watched helplessly as the cycle began anew, his voice joining the whispers that would torment the next lost soul. The eclipse pulsed one final time, and the hotel's doors opened.